Welcome everyone to the Yunus Mahomed Public Interest Award. Thank you for joining us this morning. My name is Lebogang Musiani. I'm the CEO at Kagiso Capital. My role is really to do the introductions. As you well know, some of you, this award aims to encourage students to study and practice law in a manner that promotes advancement of public interest, transparency, accountability, and ethical business practice. The award program was established in 2013 by founder and award committee member Judge Daya Pillay in honor of the late Yunus Mahomed, who was a human rights lawyer and an activist for justice, and the chairman and founding trustee of the Kagiso Trust. Kagiso Capital and Kagiso Trust have been proudly supporting the award since 2018. Today, we're going to host a virtual award ceremony to honor the National Award recipient, Nicholas Hurd. Article titled, "Should the Flag Fit or Must We Quit?" is an analysis of freedom of expression in South Africa with specific reference to hate speech and the old South African flag. So folks, you're in for quite a riveting panel discussion. The webinar will follow the form of a panel discussion moderated by Christopher Givers. Allow me, as I introduce the panelists, and really by reading briefly their bios. So I'll start with the National Award recipient. Nicholas Hurd is a final year student at the University of Pretoria, has been enrolled on the Dean's Merit List for 2018 and 2019, served as a tutor of administrative law in early 2020, and is currently doing work as a case reporter and proofreader for a project run by African Ally. He is the incumbent Chief Justice of the UP Constitutional Tribunal Student Court and a member of the editorial board of the Pretoria Student Law Review. Also allow me to introduce Kate Dury, who's a final year LLB candidate at the University of Cape Town, where she graduated with a Bachelor of Science, Social Science and Philosophy and Law distinction in 2017. She's passionate about law, both as an academic pursuit and as a tool for the progression of social, criminal, and economic justice in South Africa. Kate is a top-ranking debater and public speaker, having been awarded the Cape Bar Council Moot Court Prize in 2019, the Norton Rose Fulbright Heads of Argument Prize 2019, the Best Presenter Award of the Kate O'Regan Moot Court Competition in 2018, and winning the National School Moot Court Competition in 2013. Another panelist, Izu Sishinda from Zambia, is a Master of Philosophy in Criminology, Law and Society candidate at the Center of Criminology, University of Cape Town. An aspiring criminologist, Izu's research interests include hate crime, victimization studies focusing on sexual and gender minorities in Africa, functions of policing, and the police as gatekeeper to the criminal justice system. He served as a board member of a non-governmental organization advocating for human rights, equality, and non-discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation and gender identity expression in Mauritius, where he also undertook his undergraduate studies in the social sciences at the African Leadership University. And lastly, for Christopher Carl Givers, teaches international law and legal theory in the School of Law, University of KwaZulu-Natal. His research focuses on third world approaches to international law, critical race theory, and law and literature. Since 2015, he has been a faculty member of the Institute for Global Law and Policy at Harvard Law School. His most recent publications appear in the Oxford Handbook of International Criminal Law, the London Review of International Law, and UCLA Law Review. So without further ado, allow me to hand over to Christopher Givers, who is our moderator for today's panel discussion. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. It's nice to be here. It's wonderful to be here with you. As was mentioned, my name is Christopher. I'm from the University of KwaZulu-Natal, and it's a great honor to be here with not only the winner of the award, but two fantastic young scholars who are going to give what I think was described gently as a baptism of fire, with easy on the fire. So we'll see if the fire is ready for next time, as they say, or whether we can bring a little fire to this really interesting topic as well as we go. So I thought to get us kicked off, what I might start with is asking Nicholas, and I should say I read this paper a while back and I was one of the first to do so, and I really, really do think you bring a lot of interesting insights to what is a very topical question. And I thought you might begin by perhaps summarizing the paper a little bit for those who haven't had the pleasure of yet reading it, and maybe giving us a sense of your inspiration for writing it in the first place. And don't just say the prize money.
Oh, thank you very much, Chris, and for that praise there. Really is appreciated. So the article can be summarized as an analysis of freedom of expression in South Africa, looking particularly at hate speech and with specific reference to the old South African flag. It's a conceptual and a doctrinal evaluation of hate speech law, and it's an evaluation of our hate speech law against constitutional and other legal standards. It's a response to, so it was prompted by a case brought before the High Court, sitting as an equality court in Johannesburg, a case brought by the Nelson Mandela Foundation, and it was an attempt to have the flag displayed gratuitously as hate speech. The Section 10 of Prukhuta, which is the mechanism by which hate speech in South Africa is classified and responded to legally, was brought before the Supreme Court of Appeal, and a constitutional challenge was declared unconstitutional, and that matter is currently before the Constitutional Court, so we await that outcome. Was slightly vindicated, I suppose, by the Supreme Court of Appeal decision, but I would hasten to say that I don't fully agree with my conclusions in the paper itself. I think that this is an evolving discussion, and I'm looking forward to learning from the panelists. I think two esteemed panelists, one that I'm a colleague of. So I'm looking forward to the contestation. What I cover in the article can effectively be broken down into three stages. The first looks at the conceptual legitimacy of hate speech prohibitions and the value of speech as an inherent or indirect value, value of speech as currency within society, as a human aspect of our lived existences, as well as the harmful and divisive effects of speech and certain types of strains of speech in particular. The second leg of the journey that I try to take the reader on focuses on the constitutionality of Section 10 of Prukhuta. That's the Promotion of Equality and Prevention of Unfair Discrimination Act. And it effectively argues that for a number of reasons, and legal uncertainty, unjustifiable infringement of the right to freedom of expression, Section 10 is unconstitutional as written. And that's what the Supreme Court of Appeal found. The third leg of the journey then looks at whether we can, assuming that Section 10 is constitutional, classify the flag as hate speech when displayed. And the conclusion there is that the flag definitely, when displayed, is hurtful, and most probably, depending on the context when displayed, is hateful. And so should amount to, on a proper analysis, hate speech under Section 10 as written. But I ultimately conclude that an order on the terms that the Nelson Mandela Foundation was seeking, that the gratuitous display of the flag be declared hate speech, will not pass constitutional muster under Section 16 of the Constitution. So, I mean, that's the article in sum. Sorry, there we go.
I wonder how long that would take. I didn't think I'd do it first time. So thanks, Nick. That was a wonderfully useful summary. And I wanted to begin with our panelists by asking each of them to give us a short summary of what they found interesting about the paper. I think particularly coming as they do from different fields. We have a social scientist and a lawyer. And I thought we could maybe start with Kate to give us a reflection on what you really liked about the paper. What were your impressions of it?
So I'd like to begin by saying that I largely agree with a lot of what's put forward in this paper. So it may be more baptism than fire, as you wanted, at least for my part. We'll see what Izu has to say. I think I would like to begin by saying, for the most part, I'm going to focus and level my discussion on the second section of the paper, because I think that focuses on the legal aspect. And I think that's going to be what's most important. But I think what I would like to say is especially well argued in this paper is the section where you point out that whatever bar we set for what is acceptable speech versus what is prohibited speech is a bar is a line drawn in the sand that can easily be reused and reworked by different governments, by parties with different interests and different perspectives. I mean, I think the recent anti-mask wearing protests in the US, where you saw conservative Republicans holding signs saying "my body, my choice," shows you that the standards and arguments that we often have in mind to make a certain point can often be used by people who very much disagree with us to make a very different point. And I think that is why it becomes so important to really think very carefully about how we write the rules that we talk about, how exactly we draw those lines in the sand. Even when it feels pedantic, even when it feels finicky and overly technical to sweat over the precise wording of provisions, like the differences between Popular and the Constitution, that's actually really important. And I think that's a point that you make very well in the paper, and it's a point I very much agree with. Because whenever it comes to any kind of legal rule, that legal rule only becomes a reality for people. It only enters the real world. It only becomes a practical concern when it is interpreted and applied, whether that's by judges, whether that's by police officers, whether that's by everyday people trying to determine what they should and should not say, what they can and cannot say. So I think in that way, I very much agree with the seriousness that you approach the legal question with, and I think that's a particularly well-argued portion of the paper.
Thanks, Kate. Izu?
Wow. So just like Kate, I think for most part of what was written in the paper, I really did agree with it. But so the interesting question that Nicholas poses in this paper, which is also ironically, the title of his paper is, "Should the flag fit or must we acquit?" And of course, like he said, the paper seeks to analyze freedom of expression in South Africa, but with specific reference to hate speech and the odd South African flag. So here I was, a Zambian who's trying to discuss freedom of expression in South Africa. And then I was like, is this going to be an interesting conversation? And at which point am I going to relate to the topic of discussion? But of course, if we understand the agents of colonization, Silsi Rhodes coming to Zambia and we being part of the Rhodesian regime, then we get to understand that to a largest extent, I also relate to what that flag might represent. And the question of whether if it should fit or we must acquit is something that is worth exploring in this debate, or let me say in this discussion. So at first glance, again, I would say that because I'm coming from the social sciences and criminology background, I was taken aback when I was reading the paper because it had all these different laws that were being quoted. There was the Constitution, there was Pepuda, and then I was like, okay, you know what? Let me take Nicholas on this challenge and read his paper with an open mind, with an open view. Yes, I do understand the law, but I really needed to come in from the social sciences background to say, yes, society thinks about the law in a different way, but how does society react to most of the rules and regulations that come up, which includes hate crime or hate speech regulation? And so when I finished reading the conversation that Nick was trying to put across, as he did outline in his introduction, I did see that this is a topic that is worth exploring, considering both the historical context in which the paper is set. That is South Africa, a country that has gone through a lot of internal conflict, a country that has gone through a process of, I want to say process of transformation in which we are trying to define what nationhood looks like. And of course, we know that the flag that Nicholas is trying to talk about has got its own historical context. And the same historical context, I think that was and is going to be my point of focus, even as I try and carry this debate along. I know that Kate is going to carry you with the legal aspect, but I would also want to socialize or to create the sociological standpoint of view to the paper.
Thanks so much, Izu. So having, as we do, panelists from two different countries, one called law, one called social sciences, I thought we might start with the social science citizen, Izu, and ask you, when I read this paper, and I often come back to this, so Lewis Nkosi, who was one of South Africa's greatest literary scholars and critics, famously said that South Africa was a state but not a nation, right? That South Africa was a state in the formal sense, but its nationhood had been held back by apartheid. And he argued that South Africa would remain rent and schizoid as long as certain liberal approaches to reconciliation remained in place, what he called the politics of instant and forced reconciliation. Mm-hmm. And thinking on that idea of South Africa as a state, but not a nation, I wondered to what extent, and I think it's interesting because Nkosi called this state the Mandela Republic, and this case was brought by the Mandela Foundation. So I think there's a ghost of Lewis Nkosi perhaps hovering in the background of this case. As a social scientist from that place called social science that's so foreign to too many of us lawyers, how did you come to this question of where to situate the flag within the broader social context? Without going necessarily straight to the legal questions, which we will deal with in a moment, how do you see this as someone from the land of the social sciences coming to the state, but not the nation called South Africa?
That's an interesting question, and one that requires a little bit of reflection. But so let me, before I answer your question, let me just take a step back and say, when we think of freedom of expression, and in a young and growing democracy such as South Africa, one whose history, like I said, is that of internal conflict in terms of apartheid ideology, we must ask ourselves these questions. They might seem simple, but they're really important to understanding the construction of nationhood in South Africa, to say, what does freedom of expression really look like? And should there be, if at all, any limitations to that freedom of expression? If you're thinking about a nation that has undergone conflict, a nation that is trying to build its identity, a nation that's trying to build, quote unquote, a nationhood. So I am a keen believer to say that freedom of expression is the backbone of democracy, because number one, it allows us to know, it allows us, number one, for people to freely express their minds. It also allows people to offer accountability where it is due to the leaders that are trying to build up this nation. But the extent to which that should be prohibited is the subject of the matter. But if you're thinking around the notions of national building, the notions of identity, I'd want to think of one scholar, Benedict Anderson, that says nations are imagined communities. They're imagined communities in the sense that societies are not homogeneous. They're made up of people that are coming from different social, economic, political, cultural backgrounds. And these people have to come together to come up with what's that one thing that holds us together, that we can all look to and aspire to. One of them, I know everybody sings Nkosi Sikeleli Africa, the national anthem of South Africa, in 3 different languages, because we all want to build, to be part of this greater South Africa. And if we're thinking of other symbols that are that are part of this national building in the state of nation identity, we're thinking of flags. The current South African flag, we all know to say that it is a symbol of unity. It is a symbol that represents to say that it is a rainbow nation that is made up of people from all different races, different social, economic, and cultural backgrounds. And so if we are thinking about the nation of nationhood building, we're thinking of, say, the flag itself, even the flag in question, did represent something in the historical sense. It created the notions of saying that one race was more superior than the other. It created points of discrimination. And should we continue still seeing that flag being fit in this day and age? That's the question that we might have. So the ultimate question is, should the flag fit or must we acquit? And I pose the question, in the construction of South Africa as an imagined community, where should we place that flag? Remember that the flag, like I've said, has got a history, and depending on which side of the coin that you flip, others will see it to say it's a form of heritage because that's what was passed on from their forefathers and so on. But others who are in the majority, Black people, will see it to say that it is a symbol of oppression. It is a symbol of segregation, and also a symbol of discrimination. And I think it is a constant reminder of the apartheid regime. So coming back to the case, I believe that Nicholas quoted, which also brought about this interest and why we're debating today, which is the case Nelson Mandela Trust and another v. AfriForum and others. I believe that if you're looking at what they wanted to achieve. They wanted to the largest of extent prohibit its display in public, because then it reminds people of a specific history, and that history in itself should be counted to be hate speech. And so I think that's what I can say to your answer, to your question.
Thanks so much, Izu. A very helpful and a very useful contribution from the social sciences perspective. Kate, so as Izu puts it, one of the questions that is raised by this is what holds us together, right? As a nation or as a state, whichever one we are, what holds us together? In a very real sense, what holds us together is law, at least formally speaking. The Constitution is what holds us together, and sometimes is what keeps us apart. But I was wondering, in the piece, I picked up within that domain of law that holds us together in a very formal sense, there were debates between, for example, the Constitution and Papuda. And I wonder if you could unpack that kind of civil war in a sense within this republic, between these two different legal avenues, and really take us through the finesse and the finer details of the argument as you see it unfold in the paper.
Sure. So I think the, unity and being united as a country or a state, whatever it is a very complicated thing to actually achieve, because very often different ideas and values directly conflict with one another. So we want to say, for example, we value dignity and equality and all of these things, but at the same time, that might conflict with someone who does identify with the old South African flag. So in the process of establishing unity, we sometimes do have to draw a line in the sand where not everyone can get along because these ideas directly contradict each other. And this is basically the context in which the difference between Papuda, which is the act, and the Constitution becomes relevant, because the Constitution basically creates a fence. You can imagine it as creating like a sort of paddock. And on the inside of that paddock, you have protected speech. And you're allowed to say those things and no one's allowed to stop you. No one can sue you for it. No one can, fine you for it, etc. And then you also have Papuda, but Papuda makes that paddock smaller. So it basically reduces the amount of speech that is protected in order to protect people on the other side of the fence from whatever danger is on this side of the fence, basically. And it basically does so, and it narrows that protected speech in a number of different ways. And I think Nicholas really goes through these in quite a lot of detail and explains this really well in the paper, and basically outlines a series of differences between the Act and the Constitution and how it is that the Act constricts protected speech. So, for example, the Act refers to speech which is hateful on more grounds than the Constitution. So the Constitution, strangely enough, actually doesn't include speech that is hateful or discriminatory on the basis of sexual orientation, even though it does in the equality provision. So it's a little bit strange there, but it does include things like race and culture. Another way that it narrows it further is that it includes not only speech which advocates hatred and incites harm, but speech which advocates hatred or is harmful or is hurtful. So basically that widens the scope in two ways. It says that you don't have to incite harm and advocate hatred. So that's the first thing, is it becomes a disjunctive. It's an either or instead of a conjunctive where it has to be both. And it also includes other grounds like hurtfulness. And there's a lot of debate as to how hurtful speech is different to harmful speech. Some people have tried to argue that harmful speech is speech which is physically harmful or incites harm, but that doesn't really make sense because there's also a different standard for inciting harm. So then you would be, you would have the statute saying you can't do the same thing 2 times over. And generally when we interpret law, we don't interpret it as including redundancies or repetitions like that. So it seems that there is a difference between harmful and hurtful. And one argument that's been made by a number of people is that harmful refers to objectively harmful speech, whereas hurtful is about subjectively harmful speech. So I am personally hurt, even if somebody else, even if a reasonable person in my position would not have been hurt. But I think where I would go even further than Nicholas in his paper is to point out that the Act actually makes quite a complicated mess of the question of intention. So did the person who says the harmful speech actually mean to cause harm? So basically in law, there are a number of standards for how much you need to intend something before we think it's worthy of some kind of sanction, whether that's a fine, whatever that might be. At the highest level, you have intention. And this is where you actually mean to cause that consequence. And there are a number of subcategories of intention, the lowest of which is dolus eventualis, which basically says, did you foresee the possibility that it was going to result in this harm? And did you proceed anyway? It's about subjective foresight, whether you actually foresaw that consequence. If you go one step lower than dolus eventualis, you have the reasonable person standard, which instead of asking, did you individually and subjectively foresee this happening? It says, would a reasonable person in your position have foreseen this kind of harm? And here Nicholas points out that that's probably too low a standard for hate speech. But I would like to say that that standard is actually even lower than a normal reasonable person standard. Because if you read the section carefully, it's not saying, would a reasonable person in the position of the person who made that speech have foreseen some kind of harm? It asks whether their speech could reasonably be construed to demonstrate an intention to. So this clumsy wording actually says we're not asking, did the speaker, would a reasonable person in the position of the speaker have foreseen harm? It's asking whether a listener, a reasonable listener who overheard the speech, would have assumed that they intended harm. And the reason that's actually lower is because sometimes, even if you are, as a reasonable person, can foresee that your actions might have harmful consequences, it is nevertheless reasonable for you to do it anyway because there are other consequences. So for example, a reasonable person might foresee that if I'm driving along the road and I swerve to the right, suddenly I could damage someone's property. But they may also say, if I carry on driving straight, I might hit a child who's in the middle of the road. So the reasonable person allows these competing considerations. But what the Act does is, instead of asking us about the reasonable person in the position of the speaker or the person driving the car, it's only asking if someone on the side of the road would believe that the driver knew they would hit the fence. So it doesn't actually allow a reasonable person to make those competing considerations. And the reason that's really important in the context of speech is that in some cases, a reasonable person could foresee harm, but nevertheless think it's worth making that speech. So for example, I might foresee that if I make a particular argument about rights for the LGBT community, that could offend certain religious people. But I might, as a reasonable person, nevertheless proceed because I think it's worth it and that's important speech. But the Act wouldn't protect me. It doesn't allow those competing considerations. All the Act says is, would someone reading the paper have guessed that I knew I might offend someone with this? And that already would shut out my speech. So I think I completely agree with you that the standard of the Act, specifically in the intention puzzle, massively encroaches on the type of protection speech and reduces the size of that paddock to being way too small.
Thanks, Kate. That's a really helpful way to focus on what I think is a big part of the paper, particularly towards the end, which is this idea of intention. And I think in some sense, from a free speech perspective, you can see this as disabling or being too broad in a sense. But from the perspective of social cohesion, if you think about how intention is essentially focusing on racism as opposed to what we might think of structures of domination, right? So if we make a distinction between individual racist speech and white supremacy as a structure, it might be that also focusing on intention and speech and reducing race to being just about what people say and ignoring the broader structures actually works against the principle of social cohesion that Yunus pointed out, what holds us together. So I wondered if one way to try and pack that distinction, to try flesh out a bit precisely how race might work in society, is to turn to you, Yunus, and ask you about the way that racist beliefs are not necessarily always expressed as individual beliefs or as individual speech acts or even actions, but how they operate in a broader social and cultural environment.
Most definitely. See, it's always a very difficult conversation to have if we're going to talk about hate speech, because there's always has to be a line that needs to be drawn, and that line, I agree that when societies are disrupted because of what people say, people turn and run to the courts to go and solve their cases because there are different acts, there's the Constitution, and the Constitution becomes as an equalizer, the laws become as an equalizer between different people. But I'm still taking it back to saying, if we're going to talk about social cohesion, if we're going to talk about national building, we really need to go back to the values that hold us together, because that affects the way we see ourselves as a nation. What people say should translate to how everybody in this nation feels. And if there's a select group that because they feel that their rights are more superior than others, then definitely that needs to be prohibited to a larger extent. And yes, I know many people are going to tell me and say, but then aren't you being discriminatory, because then you are going against the very same thing that you're trying to advocate for, that people should be able to say things that they want, and so that we know. But I'm saying that we come from backgrounds and we're not making decisions, or we're not saying things from quote unquote a veil of ignorance. We are saying things because, number one, we've been socialized to believe that certain things are the way they are. And many people would say that racism is not an ideology. That's them. I'll say racism is an ideology that is inculcated in young people as they grow up, and they grow up with it. And it comes with its symbols. And those symbols need to be taken down if need be, because they do not necessarily hold to the social fabric that we are trying to aspire to. And if the odd flag is racist, number one, is discriminatory, and is considered as a form of hate speech, as in the case that was quoted by Judge Mojapelo, then for me, I certainly agree that that flag needs to be taken down. It needs to be taken down, buried. But it's also important to understand that people are coming from social, cultural context, and their socialization does impact the way they look at their world view. And then the question becomes, if people are coming from this social cultural background in which they're socialized to believe what they believe, should we limit what they're saying, or should we allow them to freely air it out so that we as a nation can know what to do? We can go into troubleshooting? Certainly yes, and certainly no. I would say yes in the context that if we allow people to say what they want to say, if it's hateful, then we're going to fix it. And if we're going to fix it, then it means to say that we need to, as a nation, go through certain process of institutional change, of reformation, whether from a systemic level, but also at an individual level. And at an individual level, it takes the person to start thinking about their actions, to start thinking about how their words, how their symbols could impact the general overview of what type of nation that we're trying to build.
Thank you, Uzu. It's very helpful. So Kate, in some senses, the case, perhaps, at least for the lawyers, that's haunting us, it's less Lewis and Corsi haunting us with nation building, but it's the Kwalani case, right? That is in the background and comes up, I think, both as an example, perhaps a comparator between different types of hate speech that reference identity and hate speech that reference structures. But I wondered if you could probably take us through how you understand this relating both legally and perhaps more generally the productiveness of that relationship or that comparison to the Kwalani case.
Right, so the Kwalani case is very interesting because it's a recent Supreme Court of Appeal case. I think it was towards the end of last year. And basically what you had is some very homophobic speech that was published, and then the Supreme Court of Appeal, so it's appealed, and then it eventually gets to the Supreme Court of Appeal. And Kwalani, who made this speech, tries to make his case by saying that Papuda, after the High Court had found that he had breached Papuda, was unconstitutional, and therefore that paddock should be widened and his speech should also be protected, basically. And it's a very difficult case because, as I just made a whole argument saying, I actually think Papuda is in many ways overbroad. But then you have this difficult test case because the speech in question was really offensive. So you have this knee-jerk reaction, or at least I do with my beliefs, that I don't want that kind of speech in society. So I disagree that the court has effectively allowed that kind of speech, but I also agree with the court for wanting to find Papuda invalid, although I disagree in some of the ways that they did it and some of the reasoning, respectfully. So basically the difficult question that we have is how do we measure the differences between wanting to protect speech and these abstract, like academic ideas that we have about what speech should be allowed, but also manage our emotional reactions when those arguments are then sort of leveled against us, and then we then have the exact kind of speech we don't want in society. And I think that speaks exactly to what Izu was just saying, which is saying that we all do come from different backgrounds. And so it's important whenever we speak, but also whenever we hear speech, to acknowledge that, and then to almost step outside of ourselves for a moment and ask ourselves beyond that emotional reaction, what is actually the appropriate response? And I think it's perfectly fair to say that while the PEPUDA is overbroad, I still think the SCA then swung perhaps too far in the opposite direction. And there's potentially a middle ground, which hopefully the Constitutional Court will arrive at when they maybe do or do not confirm the Supreme Court's order. But it also speaks to a different question, which is that different types of speech at face value may seem harmful in the same way. So, we have PEPUDA, which says no speech on the basis of sexual orientation, race, culture, etc. And these categories are all sort of put together. And that's because often in identity politics, we think of race and sexual orientation and gender and all of these things as being very similar, and they operate in a similar way. But that's sometimes not actually true. So the situation for sexual orientation versus race is quite a different, and it's not to say like one is better or worse or more harmful, less harmful, but just that it operates differently in society. So for example, you have the differences where LGBT people are a minority, whereas Black people are definitely not in South Africa. So those different power structures operate differently in how speech is leveled against individuals, right? So there's also, some interesting cases where if you were to try and put in rules that say we need to protect minorities and minority speech as an attempt to protect LGBT people from this kind of harmful speech, what you might actually end up doing is setting precedent which says that white nationalists in South Africa who are an extreme minority should also have their speech protected because of that disjunction between how the demographics of society are actually divided. So again, we have to be very careful in how we impose these rules. And I think also it might make a case for saying that rather than these acts and these, the Constitution, the statutes, listing grounds upon which you cannot discriminate, we should have a principled approach. And PEPUDA somewhat does this towards the end, where the last category of people you're not allowed to discriminate against is basically vulnerable persons who experience historical disadvantage. And while there's some problems with the way that's worded, I think in general, taking a more principled approach to trying to figure out what it is about certain types of speech that actually targets vulnerable people, rather than just looking at categories of identity or whether or not someone is technically a minority or not, because some minority beliefs are really harmful, right? We need to take a more principled approach, which can sort of make sense of those complications a lot more. And I think that also adapts to the flexibility that Izu was talking about, the flexibility that we need to have when we acknowledge that everyone is coming from different viewpoints and trying to work together, and then trying to figure out a principled way that we can do that, that protects everybody as they deserve to be.
Thanks, Kate. That's a very helpful response as well. So I want to open up the floor to some questions from the audience, but before I do, I want to just wake Nick up. Nick, you have had a very unfired baptism, but I wanted to maybe put you on the spot a little bit. What I really liked about your paper, and it was very refreshing, was that in some senses you stack your politics in the beginning. You say very clearly at one point in the footnote, you say, I wholly agree with this view. And the view that you wholly agree with is kind of the idea, the marketplace of ideas, right? That if we just air out the speech enough, it'll move the sort of, to misquote Martin Luther King, that the arc of free speech bends towards justice, that enough open air, enough sunlight will mean that all these negative views will leave our society. And I wondered whether that view, and I think at some point you cited as going back to the 17th century, I wondered how we reconcile that understanding of free speech with the modern world of so highly mediated lives, fake news, false facts. Can we really say that the more we engage, particularly online, particularly through the structures of capitalism, we are becoming more and more cohesive as a society? Can we really say the marketplace of ideas is yielding the kind of results that it promises philosophically, and is likely to do given as how our lives are unfolding? I'm just thinking what's happening in America at the moment, perhaps as an example. So if you want to give us a response, and also if you want to respond to any other of the comments as well, please go ahead.
So I think that that's a particularly important point, because obviously when the marketplace of ideas, that philosophy was adopted and enacted through academic texts and reflected in laws up until present. I mean, it was quoted, I think, in Mamabolo by the Constitutional Court as also the courts themselves have been recognizing that that's a canonical philosophy underpinning the right to freedom of expression, which effectively is we will find the right way, the truth through collision with error. That's the logic underpinning that philosophy. I think that you're quite right in making the point, to some extent, both you, Izo and Kate, you also make the point saying that, well, the ability for anyone to transact in that marketplace is premised upon the amount of capital behind their name, their reach, their status, access to technology, etc., etc. So I do think that we need to adopt a principled approach to regulating speech that both takes account of the traditional means of communication that we have used up until now, but also that looks to the future, to identity mapping, figuring out what we are as a nation. If anything, hopefully we are something, but identifying that core, and in the process, mapping and finding our identity. And I think that Kate, firstly, I wish I had spoken to you before writing the article. I would have loved to have adopted the paddock comparison. I think that the relationship between Section 16.1 and 16.2 is quite a fraught one as far as the court's understandings are concerned. I think Peter Foss writes on his blog that the SCA bungled one of the cases, at least, in their understanding. So I think, you know, if you one day argue before the SCA or the Constitutional Court, use that example. But I particularly liked your analysis or the conclusion that reasonableness is dialectical and it's a range, and you almost exclude the entire range and limit to the lowest common denominator by use of the qualifying formulation, could a reasonable person construe? So could and construe an intention on the part of. And I think that has implications for the identity mapping. What we can and can't say, and figuring out exactly where the lines lie socially, because I think as Izo, you quite rightly point out, and you as well, Chris, in your quotations, the Truth and Reconciliation event was to some extent forceful and probably under-inclusive. The TRC 1994, that sort of precipice into democracy. And we asked the question, can legal remedy, can the law socialize us out of our learned behaviors and the systems in which we've been, or by which we've been indoctrinated? I think those are the fundamental questions that we actually have to ask ourselves when we look at the effect of mechanisms like regulatory mechanisms and devices like Bapuda on everyday interaction between people and that identity mapping going forward. So I don't think that a lowest common denominator approach, if I'm concluding or inferring correctly from you, Kate, is the correct approach to go. I do think there needs to be that reasonableness range to allow us to interact, to figure out, to map out where we are as people, individuals, and as a nation going forward. Because, and just to make one last point on the technicality of Bapuda, what Bapuda effectively asks the judge to do, let's say, for example, Lamont J. Sitting in the High Court, it asks him to position himself as a white male judge to try and understand, what would ask him to abstract and gain a representative understanding of a possibly heterogeneous group or a subgroup within a heterogeneous group, and to try and figure out exactly what hurt would mean to that group or that subgroup on paper-based evidence and on testimony, when he doesn't really have the real-world lived experience that might be necessary to do that abstraction. So when we talk about judging cases as individuals, we also have to appreciate that there's a human standard, and it might not be possible to bridge that gap in court.
Thanks, Nick. So some responses. I wondered if I might, just given where we've moved to this idea that we need to take a more subjective, a more nuanced approach, just to ask you, just sort of unfairly, I guess, each one of you, whether you think that this type, so that whether you think racist speech or racist symbols should be regulated by the same law as everything else, or should we have a specific law that deals with racist speech? And if you think, the first question, Secondly, if not, do you think Papuda is up to the job? Should we be changing Papuda along the lines that you've discussed? And I think the third question might be, is law up to the job? I think as Nick, as you put it, is this something that law is capable of doing, given what we know, not just about laws past, but also the continued operation of laws present? So can we do this with law in reverse order? Can we do this with law? Is Papuda enough, or do we need a specific statute to address these types of expressions and these types of acts of racist symbols? And I'll start with you, Kate.
All right, so in terms of your first question, is law actually up for the job of regulating the speech? My answer to that would be partially, right? The law should never determine all of human behavior. That wouldn't be a free life for anyone to live. The law is there as a net to catch what slips through the cracks of all of our other social norms, all of our expectations on individuals to act with kindness and ethics, etc. So the main thing that we should be trying to do is just unpack racism in and of itself. Change the beliefs of everyone from start to finish, change the power structures through persuasion, through some kind of, through education, whatever it might require. That's what the only thing that's ever going to actually change racism is for people to stop being racist. But there is an additional harm that comes through when people then make a racist comment, and that surface level thing can be regulated by the law. And I think law in general is up for that kind of job partially, but never on its own. In terms of whether Papuda is up for the job, at the moment, I think it's potentially the case that Papuda is doing more harm than good. It overregulates the wrong kind of speech. It's not a good mechanism to protect a lot of different people. A lot of the most vulnerable people maybe don't even have access to courts to have it being applied in this way. So this is largely a debate for people who do have access to, expensive lawyers, etc., who are even able to take these cases to court. So firstly, the formulation of Papuda is not up to the job. Secondly, I think, though, we can say that there are parts of Papuda that we do want to keep. So, for example, a lot of the stuff about unfair discrimination in terms of, employment policies, etc. A lot of those parts of Papuda make a lot of sense. Do we need a separate law that specifically deals with racist speech? I would say no. I think we potentially need a separate law that deals with harmful speech, whether that's racist, whether that's homophobic, whatever kind of offensive speech it is. And that law should be principle-based. It shouldn't look at categories of speech, like this speech is racist, this is homophobic, this is sexist, because as we know, there are constantly new types of identities that people could be discriminated against for. The South African Constitution was one of the first in the world to even explicitly include sexual orientation. And now it seems like that is something we clearly should include. And, that's almost taken for granted in a lot of parts of the world now. So it should be principle-based so that it can remain flexible for different types of discrimination as our society progresses, as we start to realize that more things are harmful and more things actually maybe shouldn't be said. So to sum up then, I would say that law is partially up for the job. Papuda needs to be reformulated. Maybe a separate act should be created on speech. That act should be principle-based and have room for flexibility and nuance.
Perfect. Thank you, Kate. Izu?
Kate has said what needs to be said about Papuda, but I would like to say power is decision-making and power is thought control. Whosoever controls what words we say, the things we speak, the symbols that we hold dear to, controls how people tend to act and react to those words. So it's really important for me that where the law fails, that a sociological standpoint in which people like Kate has said are reconfigured to think about whether it's racism, it's homophobia, and all those other isms, to the extent that, yes, let us regulate what's hateful and what's harmful, that degrades the human being. Should we allow people to say whatsoever they want to say? That's a question that you all have to ask yourselves.
Thank you. That was a more legal answer than Kate's, Izu. I think you might have converted to the land of law. And Nick, do you want to make a quick, have you changed your mind completely, having gone through and hearing the views of your colleagues and friends?
No, I mean, I don't think so. I think I'm still attempting to occupy the middle ground. So is law up to the job? I, again, echo the sentiment partially. I don't think law should go too far. We need to recognize that supremacy and unjust power relations, or the crystallization of those unjust and equal power relations, are enacted in a range of settings, in a range of contexts that the law often can't even intervene in, where settings that you can't raise law as a shield. So I do definitely agree that organic change, if I could call it that, needs to be predominantly the mode of revamping society. Whether Papuda is the catalyst, in its current form, I certainly can't think that Papuda would do a very good job. I think Papuda might end up being more oppressive than it is, and it advances the dignity of individuals and groups of individuals. I personally think that perhaps we should look to Germany and some of the other European states as an example for how to go about approaching, through a regulatory framework, the vestiges of our past and the legacy of our past as it continues today. So, for example, Germany, obviously with some riders and modifications, banning the swastika, Cyprus and a number of other states following suit. Perhaps we could look at doing something similar in respect of the old South African flag. That would be a more surgical strike. But I do most definitely believe that Papuda in its current form needs to be amended. And whether we amend Papuda or replace it with another law, that law also needs to strike principally and surgically.
Thanks, Nick. So living in the land of law, I see, or law's empire, I see the judge has come to solve this dispute once and for all. But before I hand over to the judge, let me just quickly say a thank you, a big thank you to all the panelists, to Kate, Izu, and to Nick for your discussion. This was wonderful and engaging. I learned a lot more about Papuda, and I happen to teach it. So thanks so much for your excellent engagement. And Izu, thank you so much for bringing in perspective that us lawyers too often are not engaging in the kind of social science work that is just over the border. So thank you, everyone. Thank you so much. And over to you, Judge Pillay.
Thank you very much, Chris, for an excellent facilitation of a very interesting topic. It's my pleasure to thank the guests and the participants in this project. But it's also my pleasure, singular pleasure, to make the award to Nicholas Hurd for winning the National Prize for the best publication in a peer-reviewed article publication on a topic of national and public interest. So we had to delay it until Nicholas earned his award completely and complied with these terms of the contract, that he doesn't get anything until he also presents. So thank you for that. Well done. Congratulations.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you.
This is just the beginning, Nicholas, because there's still the PhD that must come along. So thank you very much to both of you. Yes, good.
Thank you.
Thank you, Nicholas.
Thank you very much.
Right. All right, let me proceed to thank the other people who are involved in this project. Let me say that, you know, this project started very humbly at the University of KwaZulu-Natal in 2013, when I delivered the Victoria and Griffith thing, a memorial lecture. And just casually, my friend Maggie Govender said, why don't you give an award like everybody else is doing? And for 3 years running at UKZN, we managed to muster just one contribution, and we said we must make an award every year. And so for 3 years we had one contribution and we made one award for those 3 years. And then Kagiso joined us, and the project has grown to 4 universities. And every year we've had more than one contribution. Each one has been scintillating in the quality, in its quality, in their qualities. It's taken us to source interlocutors, tiebreakers from Harvard, from California. Last week we did the award to the UCT candidate. So it's exposed us quite broadly to not only the South African universities and the 4 universities involved, but to other universities as well. I also use this opportunity to make an announcement that this award has attracted the attention of a few business people who want to use our infrastructure, our capacity to receive and select candidates for bursaries. As you might know, some small businesses qualify for BE certificates if they sponsor university students. So the obligation for the universities is to simply administer these funds. From our side, there is an in-principle agreement that we will facilitate these requests, and anyone who is a winner of this, of a Yunus Mahomed Public Interest Award will automatically qualify or will automatically be recommended for a bursary, any bursary, provided, of course, they comply with the requirements of the particular bursary. So while we're a non-racial competition, we do not look at, or we don't take into account race, gender, origin, nationality, color, beliefs, and so on. A BEE award has to comply with very specific requirements, such as people with, the awardees must be people with disability or of a particular race or gender. And there may be other qualifying requirements for other awards. But our view is that we want to encourage people to write clearly, concisely, in matters of public interest, in the interest of advancing constitutional democracy and activism about constitutional democracy. And so to that extent, sponsoring our candidates, our winners, to move on to acquire other levels of education, postgraduate and so on, we would welcome these contributions. So it leaves, what I'm left to do now is to thank everybody for their various roles in this project. Of course, Nicholas, without you, we wouldn't have had a winner. We wouldn't have had this wonderful discussion on freedom of expression with a particular interest, a focus on hate speech. As we showed, your award consists of a 10,000 Rand check, a very large one, in size certainly, but we hope to improve in due course. My takeaway from your paper, I mean, there are many angles to it, but my takeaways that stands out is this. Like Darwin's theory of natural selection, freedom of expression is an evolving concept driven by local conditions. So what was not hate speech before the First World War, before the Second World War, during apartheid, might well be so now. I like the idea that law alone is not a driver of transformation, that transformation should be organic, people-centered, ground upwards is the way to go. So that means sitting in our armchairs is not going to be enough, and sitting before cameras is not going to be enough. We have to stomp the ground and mobilize people towards believing and changing their beliefs and practices towards the great ends of our constitution. Secondly, my second takeaway is that I don't think, or one should be careful about how hard one comes down on freedom of expression, a point you make, Nicholas, in your paper, because you don't want to drive expression underground. It could become subversive and counterproductive to the aims of a constitutional democracy. We want we want as much capacity or ability to ventilate grievances. We want to promote public dialogue. and we must regulate or deal with freedom of expression that promotes those values or balances those values appropriately. So thank you, Nicholas, for participating in the competition and for contributing to this debate. Now, as I said, we'll wait for your doctoral thesis. To Kate Dewey and Isu Sichenga, you took time to prepare for this article, for this debate, and you made time to be here. And yes, a very, very valuable contribution from each of you. Thanks to my colleagues on the award committee representing 4 universities, Andre Berain from the University of Pretoria, Donnie Brandt from the University of Free State, Chris Grievers, thank you for also volunteering and doing an excellent job today, from the UKZN, Henry Mostert from the University of Cape Town. It takes time to read every article that comes through, to evaluate them, and then to say who should win the competition at university level and then at a national level. We also thank the interlocutors and tiebreakers who have made themselves available to us at various stages. Thanks to, of course, Kagiso Trust, which Yunus co-founded, along with Wambeas Nadir, Archbishop Tutu, and many other stalwarts of our struggle. Thanks to Kagiso Capital for sponsoring the prizes, for managing the administration of the award, and the award event. A special thanks goes to Rose Mashlope, who holds us all together. I must acknowledge, as I've done, Maggie Govender, who suggested that I memorialize Yunus's contribution to the struggle for democracy with this award. Finally, the papers of all the winners from inception are on the Yunus Mahomed Public Interest Award website, hosted by Kagiso Capital. Those who missed the article, Nicholas's article, you'll find it on the website. And thank you very much once again. Goodbye.